In this second of three videos, short little videos on the nature of slavery, we'll look at what slave life was like on a daily basis. In the antebellum age, as we've already noted, the majority of slaves worked in agricultural pursuits, and most were working on small farms where there weren't a great deal of slaves, great deal number of slaves. The thing is, we don't know much about life on this type of small farm because the owners had to work too much, to keep diaries or to record what happened with the slave lives. So we know a lot more about those slaves on the few large plantations, but not much about the daily life of the slaves on small farms. In small farms, the owners would generally work side by side with the slaves, and this tended to make it less brutal. Obviously, if you work side by side with somebody, you begin to see the humanity in them. On smaller farms, there was less division of labor. All the slaves were usually required to do a variety of different tasks, depending on the time of day or the time of year. Obviously, things were different on these large plantations where we know a little bit more. There were two distinct types of slaves that existed on these large plantations, the house servants and the field hands. And obviously, the house servants were the jobs that most slaves wanted. Life was a little bit easier there. The house servants would do things like take care of the house and yards, the cleaning and repair. They'd manage the garden, the planting and crops when other than the subsistence crops, the crops that the family would eat, and they'd plant flowers and stuff like that. They would do other personal tasks such as cooking, cleaning the clothes, driving the carriages, even babysitting. And the house servants were anxious to train their children train them in the skills that they had as house servants, trying to ensure that their children's future was as a house servant as well. Among some slaves in big plantations, house servants became sort of a status symbol, and many ended up hurting themselves so they would be unable to work in the fields and would have to work in the house, and hoping that they'd catch on as a house servant itself. In the fields, these large plantations used the gang system of slaves. A group of slaves would be assigned a common task that would be controlled by an overseer. The overseer was a white freeman hired by the plantation owner and was the one to instruct the slaves when to begin work, when to eat, when to go to the bathroom, when to quit. They would do just about everything. In the deep south on rice plantations, the gang system was sometimes abandoned and slaves were given specific individual tasks to do, but generally the overseers were the people who were out there controlling the daily lives of the slaves on these large plantations. You saw slave overseers. They would often complain that slaves had little initiative. They would say that the African Americans were innately slack and lazy. And that, of course, was because they were being forced to work and they were trying to protest, and the overseers would simply take it as innate laziness. It was generally held that any one slave was required to cultivate about 3 acres of cotton, or 3 acres of cotton required one slave. And this didn't include the other jobs that were related, like clearing the land, burning underbrush, mending fences, breaking the soil, carrying water, and all the other different things. Just you could count on one slave getting about 3 acres of cotton. And to achieve all this work, the overseers would work slaves from sunup to sunset. Sometimes an overseer would even work field hands into the night if the owner feared inclement weather might ruin a crop. Overseers were the ones who could be especially brutal. Since overseers came from non-slaveholding and frequently landless whites, they had no interest other than a temporary concern in the institution of slavery. They had no motive except to earn money from the slave plantation owner. And they were often angry at the large institution. They felt like treated them badly. They were mad at society at large because, working out in the fields with the slaves was regarded in the Deep South as pretty low level. And so they were free to take out their frustrations on the slaves that were right before them. And, so you get all these examples of particularly brutal behavior in the antebellum period. One mistress who had a slave overseer burn a a slave around the neck with hot tongs, and one drunk overseer killed a slave, cut him up, and threw him piece by piece into the fire. One Mississippi overseer killed a disobedient slave and an axe hacking. Just horrible things. But the overseer had no interest, no financial interest in the health or welfare of the slave, unlike the owner. And the owner wasn't around, and the overseer's frustrated, and so it could be that's where the real brutality could be. On some large plantations, there was a central slave kitchen, but generally most slaves are responsible for their own preparation and cooking of food. Slaves are usually given a small daily or weekly ration of meal, some meat or salt pork, and they were often allowed to grow little crops at night or on a little plot of land. As I said, that wasn't considered their property, but they managed it as their property, and that's how they survived. On some large plantations, they allow the slaves to even raise chickens or some type of meat, but generally this could incur the wrath of the overseer or even the owner if it appeared the slave was spending more time growing their own crops or raising their own livestock, and it was hurting their work on the slave. House servants could occasionally eat food stolen from the owner's kitchen. Again, that was an advantage of being a house servant, but they had to be careful so that obviously nobody would notice. On holidays such as Christmas, the cotton plantation owner might provide items such as cheese, coffee, or candy to boost slave morale. Housing was uniformly poor for all slaves. Most were in small, kind of crude huts where there weren't even wooden floors. Slaves often were required to build their own cabins, and it's interesting because some historians noticed that here they tended to adopt West African models. When there was more than one room, which was sometimes, which itself was uncommon, the slaves would adopt an I shape where there was one room after another from front to back. In contrast, most European dwellings extended sideways with 2 rooms in the front. Anyway, most would have a bed or a chest or a wooden stool and some earthenware or cooking supplies, but many of the poorer ones had to sleep on quilts laid on the floor with only straws for cushion. It was common that there was lack of room. Slave records show that in one Mississippi plantation, for example, 24 16-foot by 14-foot huts housed 150 slaves, or about 6 people per hut. Until recently, some historians have noted that the fact that slaves were seldom in the cabins made space less of a problem, but the reality contends that no slave had any degree of privacy. Adequate clothing was always a problem, especially for field hands. Often house servants were given the cast-off garments of the owners. Again, another benefit of a house servant. Other house servants might develop weaving skills and have access to some of the clothes, to be able to make or augment their own clothes. Others had to do with what they called Negro clothes, which is the field hands, which could be virtually rags with no real clothing provided at all. Slaves in the fields often didn't get shoes, and that included during the winter months. While planters saw the connection between providing adequate food and getting good labor, clothing was something else. I mean, for the owner, who cared? All slaves had little opportunity for any social activities. Obviously, since when they were not working, they were resting and sleeping. They were necessities, and they didn't have any extra time for anything else. The only slaves who had any time off were often the very, very young children. They were allowed to play, while often with some of the whites of the same age throughout their on the plantation. They would run around the fields or cabins. But when the kids got up to a useful age, play for black kids was over, and they began to work. For the white kids, that's about when their education would begin. There were a few days that broke the harsh daily routine of the plantation. There were races or fairs or militia musters or even election days. They could be festive occasions that broke the regular rhythm of slave life. Some Sometimes owners would bring along key slaves with them, while others were, preferenced by the owner to be in charge when the owner was gone, and that could change the rhythms of the day. On Christmas, usually work stopped, and that could be up to a week, except for the obviously the daily jobs of washing and cleaning clothes. On the Atlantic seaboard, much of the Christmas festivities often centered around the John Canoe celebration. It was a practice established first by slaves in the Caribbean, where they would dance and sing and ultimately go to the owner and ask for a Christmas present. It kind of shows you the subservient, sort of childlike behavior of the way the slave owners saw the slaves. Slaves were allowed, even sometimes encouraged, to sing during their work. It sort of relieved the monotony of work, and a lot of the songs were about dissatisfaction of their worldly status. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land, or look away into heaven, Lord, for thy soul's going to heaven, Jesus shall you be born. Heaven, heaven, everybody talking about heaven, ain't no heaven here type of singing. There's some of the songs that were passed down from generation to generation. As time passed in the antebellum age, Sunday slowly became a less stringent work days, and slaves were openly adopting Christianity, were more openly adopting Christianity, and they would obviously sing on Sundays. While the time had long since gotten over, while the slave owners had long since gotten over their angst over enslaving Christians, the Christianity was now seen as sort of a way to keep them under control. Bishops and high church officials in the South even commonly held slaves. In Louisiana, the Episcopal bishop even had 400 slaves, and an Episcopal bishop even had 400 slaves himself. While many African free blacks were a member of the African American Methodist Episcopal churches, Richard Allen's AME churches, many Southern slaves were in the Baptist and Methodist denominations. And it's interesting to look at the way that the Christianity the slave owners wanted the slaves to adopt, and the way the slaves actually looked at Christianity. Many African Americans ignored the doctrine of original sin and predestination, and they paid less attention to the New Testament's view as God as a lawgiver or a symbol of authority. Instead, they looked at slaves as God as a liberating warrior of the Old Testament, kind of like Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt. God was going to save his chosen people. That was the type of Christianity that the slave owners focused on. Slaves had little opportunity for romance or courtship. It was only allowed in situations where the owners expressed a genuine interest in the moral development of the slaves, but that was kind of rare. Owners would on occasion allow slave marriages, but usually only within plantations, and that was to encourage slave children. Marriage with a slave from another plantation might risk the slave running away or decreasing his or her efficiency. The permanency of a slave marriage depended upon the extent to which the couple had the opportunity to live and work together, to develop common life experiences, and sometimes that was, of course, not the case. African American slaves denied the official rituals of marriage, often devised their own rituals to affirm the marriage within their own community. First, they got permission from the parents or the elders, then got the owner's permission to live together in a cabin. Following West African customs, many couples signified their union by jumping over a broomstick together in public. Unlike whites, the ceremonies didn't include the words, "till death do you part." Everybody knew the reality that probably wouldn't be the case. More common than slave marriage was white men using black slave women as concubines, and as a result, there was significant intermixture of slaves and whites. Blacks and whites, especially in cities like Charleston, Mobile, and New Orleans. In New Orleans, it was virtually accepted that rich young white men would have a harem of black women. Many women gave in because of physical fears, but probably more common was the slave woman hoping for advantages for herself or her children. It should be absolutely clear that children born from such unions were full slaves. They may have a slave-owning father, they may be half white, but they themselves were slaves because they were born to a slave mother. How the fathers reacted to them varied, but most simply ignored them. We have sometimes you see some of these white slave-owning men sort of trying to atone for their sins by freeing their own offspring in their wills. By 1850, the total mulatto slave population was 250,000 out of 3.2 million. By 1860, it was 400,000 out of 3.9 million. The numbers might well have been higher since the numbers were based on those who physically looked a bit white, looked like they were mixed race, and undoubtedly many of mixed race look completely white or completely black. This practice of white slave-owning men having black slave concubines was interesting because it helped develop perhaps former sexual roles in the larger South. White women began to put on an air of, or be put on an air of a social pedestal. They were virtuous, they were clean, they were not like men. Men were libidinous. Men would cheat you. What the white women would not like sex, the white men would, and so white women would sometimes put up with the black female concubine because the assumption was that men were animalistic, and in letting them have sex with black slaves would keep them from cheating with white women, which would be a threat. Nevertheless, these white women would then take out their frustration undoubtedly on the victims of their husband's rape. The black slave women would often then be punished by the white slave-owning wife. In any event, this concludes the short little video on slave life in the antebellum South.